All right, cotton gin. Again, most of the work that was done by growing and processing cotton was done by slaves. And if you go to South Georgia, you'll still see a whole lot of cotton fields, particularly if you go right around this time of year, late September and early October, when the cotton is starting to, what you might say, get ripe. How many of you know what I'm talking about? Okay, all right, good. Most of you don't. I mean, this is a big city, but that's okay. The existing roads were improved. Often roads were dirt. Dirt roads became muddy, particularly folk in the spring when the snows would melt and leave a whole bunch of mud. The dirt roads become muddy and difficult for wagons and coaches, particularly in wet weather, rainy weather. Road building was slower in the south because southerners did not travel as much. The roads were okay for carrying passengers, but not suitable for carrying a lot of grain, so a lot of your grain transportation was done within 30 miles of some river that you could navigate. And a navigable river means a river that you can get a barge on. Now, the invention of the railroad and the invention of the paved road was to change a lot of this. But in those days, there were very few paved roads, and the country did not have the resources to pave hundreds of miles of road. That was to come though later. Canal building also was to come later. We'll talk more about canals and railroads as time comes. Banking, very, very important, folk, you may or may not realize. Without lending institutions, you cannot have a complex economy. All right, I spent 27 years at Lockheed, and what if Lockheed could only have paid us when it sold a plane? It would take months to put the plane together, during which time we'd all starve. Then finally the company would get the plane together, get it tested, sell it. Then we'd all get thousands of dollars worth of back pay at once. I mean, you know, that's really a bad world to live in, as it is. That's what actually Lockheed would pay us every week. Well, how did Lockheed get the money? They had accounts with the banks. Most of you will probably buy a car through some lending institution. I do. Most of you will finance your home through some lending institution. Again, without banks, most of us could never afford a home. Without banks, most of us would never be able to buy a car. But the bank will loan us the money. The dealer is happy he gets his money. Then we have to take care of paying the bank on a monthly installment. Installment lending, again, there are risks. I mean, it's like credit. You can find yourself too deeper in than you can get out. And sometimes folk, it can't be helped. Like, what if you come down with a very serious illness and have to pay thousands of dollars, or some member of your family come down with a serious illness? Sometimes it just can't be helped. And of course, you can always have the option of declaring bankruptcy, where that you don't have to pay your debt. And of course, that goes on your record permanently, and your name gets in the newspaper. At least it did when I was young. I don't know what the latest laws are on it. I've never done it myself, but there were times we came close to thinking about it. Banks would spring up all over the country. Bankers became wealthy. Bankers would issue banknotes, and they created a whole lot of new money. These banknotes would be treated as money, and the bank would guarantee payment if you carried that banknote to the bank. So banknotes, now today there are banknotes, but they're not to be traded as money. Money at one time was like gold and silver coins, then it became paper. Today it's electronic transactions, or you might say plastic cards. All right, on a personal note, I ate breakfast this morning, paid for it with a plastic card. Anyway, most of us probably are. I mean, these days, it's just simply a fact of life. And yes, you run a risk of being hacked. Anyway, that's moving far afield. Now, Hamilton. The government moved from New York to Philadelphia. Washington moved with it. Washington was president for 8 years. He was only in New York for just a few years, but the government operated in Philadelphia. Actually, I think Washington was in New York only for a few months. The government moved to Philadelphia while the city of Washington was being built. The purpose of that was to keep the South happy. Now, the city of Washington, D.C. was located in what was at that time the center of the country. In other words, Georgia and Maine were just as far from Washington, each side. But Washington, D.C. was located in what was then the center of the country. Now today it looks on a map like it's on one edge of the country. That's true. But in those days it was the center of the country such as it existed at that time. And to keep the South happy, they moved the capital first from New York to Philadelphia. Philadelphia had better facilities at that time than Washington did. Hamilton proposed a three-part solution. Let's see, he put it about in his report on public credit. Now, during the war, the government had issued a whole lot of bonds. Hamilton said that all the debts that were accumulated by the Articles of Confederation, actually this is in the Constitution, all the debts that the Articles of Confederation had accumulated were to be paid by the new government. But he said what we need to do is call in the old bonds and issue new bonds that would bear interest. So the people who had bonds went to the local banks, if they traded their their old bonds for new bonds, and the new bonds would bear interest. He wanted to create a national bank also and encourage manufacturing. Now, folk, in view of what happened, this is very important. Hamilton envisioned a nation of manufacturers. He envisioned a nation of craftsmen. Now, he did not envision an airplane factory like what I worked at for 27 years. He did not envision a railroads where they would have people scattered all over the country employed. He envisioned small craftsmen making things like shoes and guns and clothes and whatever to be made. He did not envision a large factory. Thomas Jefferson opposed Hamilton. He said, no, the best profession a man can have is farmer. He envisioned a nation of farmers. Now, in view of what wound up happening, manufacturing won the day and farmers kind of took a back seat. Now, a lot of persons had collected war bonds from other people. Like, again, a person might loan the government $10 and get a $10 war bond, fall on hard times, so sell this $10 war bond for $2 worth of goods. So a few people then accumulated a lot of bonds at like a $10 bond for $2 or a $5 bond for $1. Hamilton said that we're going to pay these bonds off at their original value, and a lot of persons got really rich fast because the new government was going to buy their bonds that they had gotten cheaply. And a lot of persons felt like they'd been left out. Hey, I sold this $10 bond for $2 worth of goods, and now, well, if you dabble in the stock market, the market might go down today and you say, oops, it's going to crash, I'm going to get out. And as soon as you get out, the market go back up, and guess what? You've missed the ride. Hopefully none of you yet know what I'm talking about, but you will, a lot of you will someday. But you missed the ride. Will the market ever crash again? Yes. When? I don't know. When it does, how low will it go? I don't know. But it will crash again. Why? Because it always does. Sooner or later, but it goes back up. At least in the lifetime of me, my dad, and my granddad, and great-granddad, it always has. So it goes down, it goes back up. Another thing, only about 2% of Americans had a lot of money in bonds. These people, though, were the ones who kept the government going because they had loaned the government so much money. And again, Hamilton was accused of favoring the rich. Perhaps it did. But again, folk, you heard me say a few minutes ago, the richer the rich get, the richer we all get. Now, I've heard that the rich are snakes. I went to a snake show one time by Ross Allen in Florida. He'd been bitten by several venomous snakes, but he said this about the snakes, that as much as we hate them, we're going to someday get rid of all of them. Between our automobiles and the fact we want to kill everyone we see, we're going to kill all the snakes, and then we'll miss them when they're all gone. And we'll wish that we had them back. We don't realize how much good they do us. Countries that have gotten rid of the rich have missed them. But anyway, yes, he favored the rich, perhaps. Again, folk, he was setting in motion what was to become the richest nation on earth. Now, the federal government still did not have any power to tax. The power of the government to tax was to come by the 16th Amendment, where the government could tax your income. So the government didn't have this power at the time. But anyway, Hamilton proposed a plan. Madison and Jefferson opposed it. Cabinet meetings became somewhat tense. A bank bill was passed by Congress anyway, and George Washington asked Thomas Jefferson, should I veto it or sign it? Jefferson said, veto it. Hamilton said, sign it. Washington signed it. Jefferson was very upset and wanted to resign, but Washington tactfully persuaded him to stay. National Bank was set up, the Bank of the United States. The government would own 1/5 of it, the other 4/5 to be given to private investors. This bank would control interest rates, credit, and value. Basically, this bank was the ancestor of the Federal Reserve. This was not the Federal Reserve, that was to come later. Madison tried to stop the plan. Madison was in Congress at the time. He tried to stop the plan. Jefferson argued the plan is unconstitutional. The Constitution never gave the government the right to set up a bank. But the bank bill went through. Madison was upset. Jefferson was upset. Then Madison proposed a tariff on imports. This plan did not get through Congress, even though tariffs did get through later. Now we come to the part about the Whiskey Rebellion, and I can see I'm going to have to close pretty soon. All right, this affected, okay, I have ancestors who live in Western Pennsylvania, but a lot of Revolutionary War soldiers, after the war, they'd been given land in Western Pennsylvania. I mean, the government promised them land, so the government, in keeping with the promise, gave them land that it had in Western Pennsylvania, particularly around the Pittsburgh area. Then the government passed a law taxing whiskey. The grain farmers in Western Pennsylvania felt this was unfair. People evaded the tax. Hamilton was upset. Farmers protested the tax. The Congress reduced the tax a little, but discontent remained high. Some farmers resorted to doing the same thing to tax collectors that they'd done to English tax collectors during the Stamp Act days. But a tax collector in Western Pennsylvania wouldn't be intimidated. His house was burned down. 7,000 angry farmers then marched toward Philadelphia. Washington replied by collecting 15,000 federal troops to move against the rebels. There was no fight. The rebels dispersed. The Whiskey Rebellion goes down in history as the first example of a conflict between minority rights and majority rule. The tax bill had been passed by both houses of Congress, signed by the new president, and Washington said, well, we've got to show that we have muscle. We've got to show some strength. He did. He moved against, and he knew that some of the men who were taking part in the rebellion were men who had served directly under him during the war. But he said, these men have to know the federal government means business. The tax, by the way, was collected, and this proved that the federal government had the authority to tax. Now, most presidents who have served 2 terms have had a tough time of it their second term. George Washington was no exception. There was a war going on in Europe, a brutal Indian war. The Indians uprose in the West. The French Revolution threatened to drag America into that war. French Revolution got its idea from the United States, but unfortunately the French Revolution was not like the American Revolution at all. Now, the Indians. Folk, in today's world, if the government would make a treaty with the Indians today, we could enforce it. We have helicopters, we have the internet, we have telephones, we have cell phones, all this stuff. Didn't have any of this back then. George Washington made a treaty with the Indians that he knew it would be impossible to enforce. He said, we white will not come to a certain point of land. You can have all the land west of this territory. White settlers moved in anyway, and again you might say, well, why didn't the whites go in and do it? Well, they couldn't find them. I mean, you might think, well, hey, couldn't they? They had no airplanes. They had to just simply go by foot or by horseback, find a settlement and try to move them out. And it was difficult. In fact, George Washington said, we just don't have enough men in the army to keep the white settlers from moving into territory promised to Indians. So these promises we made were impossible to enforce. And keep in mind, I mean, here's this little white man. One of the gripes the Indians had was that the white man was not keeping his treaties. And again, hear that from the white man. This is very true. The land was the Indians first. The white man was not keeping his treaties. On the other hand, the fighting on the part of the Indians was suicide. They were hopelessly outnumbered, and they didn't realize that by this time they had no chance at all to win. St. Clair was an unpopular governor of Ohio, and again, I came from Ohio before I moved south. I mean, my ancestors lived in western Pennsylvania, but my dad moved to Ohio. St. Clair was a governor of Ohio. The worst loss the white men ever faced in an Indian battle was when St. Clair was defeated. President Washington then sent an army into the area, led by men who had, General Mad Anthony Wayne. The city of Waynesboro, Pennsylvania, which probably none of you have ever heard of, was named after him, Mad Anthony Wayne. Mad Anthony Wayne grew up there. Mad Anthony Wayne got the name Mad because he spent a lot of his time drunk. But he had served in Washington's army as a general. But Mad Anthony Wayne was sent to lead the army that Washington got there. Wayne met the Indians at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. Here's a story. He learned that the Indians would not eat before battle. I mean, eating they felt would slow them down. There is narrative. So Wayne pretended to give battle. No battle. Day two, Wayne pretended to give battle. No battle. After 10 days of this and 10 days of not eating, the Indians were very, very weak. Then Wayne gave battle. Clobbered the Indians, forced the Indians into a treaty. This fallen timber, because apparently a tornado had hit the area at one point there and knocked down a whole lot of trees. That's why it's called fallen timbers. The Treaty of Greenville said that we give you goods if you keep the peace. The goods consisted of hatchets, liquor, and folks, something else. And this is one of the worst parts of the relationship. The Indians were given blankets, where the persons who had been on the blankets that had smallpox. I don't know if the white man deliberately infected the Indians with smallpox or not. But this story has gotten out that the Indians were given blankets by the white man, who, when the white people knew that these blankets had held sick people. Now, the other thing, liquor. And folk, if this sounds racist, I'm not going to apologize, because I learned this to be true, especially with the Army. The effect of alcohol on Indians is just devastating. Not like the effect of alcohol on Africans or Europeans. It just simply makes the Indians go completely lose their mind, go completely crazy. And some of you might know what I'm talking about. Chinese people, a lot of them are the same way. Oriental people, Far Eastern people, which leads people to believe that the Indians came from there. But the Indians were given alcohol, and the result was they became more addicted to it than a lot of Europeans did. And the effect was to make them completely, utterly stupefy them. Now again, if you find that offensive, I do too, but it's just simply, I mean, it's there. It's there, it happened. All right. With that, everybody have a good weekend. I hope to see you on Monday.